I've been asked to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Matt Staver. And we could do that with a long, long list of his accomplishments, things he's been involved with, Supreme Court, Fox News, a lot of those things, but they're too numerous to mention. What I would like to say briefly about Mr. Staver is he is truly a modern-day David facing Goliath, truly, in every sense. And as he speaks tonight, I'd ask you to listen very carefully. He's not going to be the type of presenter that dances around the stage and entertains you. That's not his style. But his style is very strong. He has a powerful message, and I guarantee you that if you listen carefully and you take to heart what he shares with you, it will change your life. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Matt Staver.
Well, it is good to be with you. I was just in Dallas this morning and spoke there at an event called Christian Values Summit. And it is great to see these kinds of meetings happening all over the country where Christians are coming together. And in fact, as I was sitting in the back when Kamal was speaking, he looked down, he says, "How much time do I have?" And somebody in the back says, "All night." I realized this wasn't a Baptist or a Presbyterian meeting. So this is my kind of crowd. It is good to be here. I want to give you greetings from my wife, Anita. She is my very best friend. She is president of Liberty Council. And we just celebrated our 30 years of marriage together. So thank you. Liberty Council is an international religious liberty nonprofit organization advancing the sanctity of human life, religious freedom, and the family through litigation, education, and policy. Basically, in short, we're the opposite of the ACLU. We are very pleased to work with Bill and this great group, and Bill and I serve on the same board on the Timothy Plan, and it's been great knowing him and watching this ministry grow. But I want to talk to you tonight about some of the things that we're involved with in our country, where we are. And by the way, let me just, before I do that, share a quick story with you about Justina Pelletier. Have anybody heard about that case on Fox News? We were really blessed and privileged to be able to represent the family. And she, after 16 months of imprisonment in the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, was freed at last on June 18, 2014. And on Tuesday and Wednesday, Justina was in Washington, D.C., speaking to members of Congress, sharing her testimony with her dad and her oldest sister, Jennifer. She is free at last. She has a long way to go. I want to thank you for your prayers and your support for her. No one should ever have to go through what Justina went through. No one should ever have to face what the family faced when they took Justina at the direction of their treating physician at Tufts Medical Center across town to Boston Children's Hospital so that they could see her treating gastroenterologist who had just moved from Tufts to Boston Children's. And it would have been a routine visit, in and out, see the doctor who's now there, go back to your private school, go back to your figure skating competitions. But instead, she was greeted by a brand new doctor, 7 months out of medical school, and a psychologist whose position is that 1 out of every 2 children have mental conditions rather than physical conditions. So whenever they complain about something physical, it's really not physical, it's in their head. So you need to stop all the medical treatment and give them psychology and psychiatric care. So when Justina presented, she had gastrointestinal distress. She wanted to see Dr. Flores, and instead of calling him in, even though he was now working at Boston Children's, they said, "No, I think it's all in your head. Here's the new treatment plan," to mom and dad, gave them a 1-page form and said, "All right, no more medications, no more medicine, no more medical treatment. You can't talk about anything medical in the presence of your own daughter," who was 14 at the time. "And by the way, no second opinions either. Sign it at the bottom. This is the new direction." They said, "What about Dr. Flores?" "Well, we're not calling him in. He's not necessary, it's all in her head. That's what our position is." And they said, "Well, no thank you, we'll check her out. We'll go back across town, back to Tufts, to see the chief of the metabolic services at Tufts, which was a treating physician. And they said, no, not so fast. They called in the Department of Children and Families, and the family was not even able to go back into the room to say goodbye to their 14-year-old daughter. And that saga went on for 16 months. She went from a competitive figure skater to being in a wheelchair. She lost a lot of her hair due to the stress. She went through all kinds of mental and physical abuse in the custody of the Department of Children and Families. The head of DCF finally resigned in the heat of all of this media pressure. Also, at the same time, what happened was a little 5-year-old boy, one of the 100-plus kids that they have lost contact with. They don't know where they are. They've just lost them in the system. They lost this little boy a year and a half, 2 years ago, and his decomposed body was found, and the head of DCF finally stepped down. So this is a mess. It's not fixed yet, and it's not just with Boston Children's Hospital. It's the nanny state that thinks it knows better than parents. And they've come up with a term called parentectomy. So thank you for your prayers for her. Continue to pray for Justine and the family. They have a long way to go, but she's free at last. God, we're thankful to God for that. As I said, my wife and I just celebrated our 30th anniversary. And we took a cruise to the Mediterranean. And it was a wonderful, relaxing time to celebrate and relax. But one of the most significant days on that cruise was when we got off in Italy. And we visited Mount Vesuvius. And then from there we went to Pompeii. And so that's why I titled my message tonight, Living in the Shade of Vesuvius. Because Vesuvius is one of the most famous volcanoes in the world. Why? Because in 79 AD it erupted. And it buried Pompeii and nearby Herculaneum. Those are the only two cities that we have in world history that were buried intact. So when Anita and I were able to walk through the ruins of Pompeii, these were not ruins that are just tiny little rocks down on the ground. You can kind of imagine this is a full-blown city. The S tile that we see on houses today, the orange S tile, that's not new. It was back then. It's still on the roofs in some of the places in Pompeii. The red brick with the mortar in between, we didn't just invent that. It's there in Pompeii, 2,000 years old. It's still standing there. Because what happened when Vesuvius erupted is it went up in a column all the way up to the troposphere into the stratosphere. And when it hit the stratosphere, that column flattened out like a mushroom and it came down. And when the wind blew, it came down and landed on Pompeii and Herculaneum. And they were living in the shade of Vesuvius. They did not know it was a volcano. They just thought it was another mountain. They even had wine that was grown from grapes on Mount Vesuvius, and they called it Vesuvian wine. And they drank that and sold that in Pompeii and Herculaneum because this was a very fertile place. This was a place that had volcanic lava underneath all the vegetation, and they didn't realize it was a volcano. They couldn't see the crater. Why? Because it was 700 to 800 years before 79 AD. 79 AD, this had erupted. So it was silent for 700 to 800 years. And so when it erupted 700 to 800 years before 79 AD, the people moved away, the history got lost, the vegetation grew up, and it became just a nice-looking, luscious mountain. They did not know what was brewing underneath Mount Vesuvius. They didn't understand the pressure that was building, and they had no idea they were living in a place in history where their lives one day would be catastrophically changed. And when we went there, we walked through the roads. I mean, it's an amazing place. They have paintings that are still on the walls. You can see the original color paint on some of the walls. Paintings that are just intricate by artists, and then others that are less intricate by somebody who's less versed in artistry. We see that on one of the walls there was a political election taking place. And one of them was a propaganda message against one of the candidates. And they said in there that if you vote for that candidate, you're a thief because the candidate's a thief. It was right in the middle of an election. This was a place that was very pagan. It had a temple and many temples, had many gods, but it had a temple to Apollo, the Greco-Roman god. And it had a temple to Isis, the Egyptian god, among many others. It was a very pagan society. And in this society, it was also very sexualized, because there were, as they found the remnants, all kinds of male body parts that they would use as jewelry or necklaces for good luck charms. They found all these different kinds of models of people engaged in different acts. It was a very sexualized, very pagan society. They prayed to these pagan gods for protection and for help, and they had no idea what was about to take place. But on 79 AD, when they woke up, they were doing what Pompeians and Herculeans did every day. They went to work, they had breakfast, they did all the different things that was going on that day. They went to their temples, they prayed to their idols, they engaged in debauchery. All of that happened in 79, and they didn't know what was going to happen that day. We only know about this because Pliny the Elder was a captain in the Navy. He was stationed over there in Napoli, which is Naples, or in that area. And he saw this mountain start to erupt. It erupted for 2 to 3 days. He asked Pliny the Younger, his nephew, to go with him so he could go help these people. And Pliny the Elder went. Pliny the Younger made the right decision, and he didn't go. He stayed there, didn't follow his famous relative. Pliny the Younger was there, and Pliny the Elder went, and he also lost his life in that eruption. So as this eruption was taking place, Pliny the Younger wrote about what he saw. And for years, we just thought it was sort of fictitious until we found the actual place of Pompeii in Herculaneum. And it was first discovered in about 1700 years afterward. It's an amazing place to see, because time stopped in 79 AD, and you're walking through people's living rooms, the streets on which they walked that morning, the houses, the walls, all of life stopped in 79 AD. And you'll see some of these famous pictures of these people completely encased, because when this lava and the mudslide and all of the debris and the heat from the volcano came down on Pompeii and Herculaneum, it was between 400 and 900 degrees Fahrenheit. It instantly killed them. It carbonized their bones. It immediately vaporized these individuals. And their bodies then were replaced by ash. And so when they found them, they're like these little places in the floor, in the ground, and they put cast in them, and so you can see their body. And so we saw people's bodies where they're laying like this with their hands on their head, or laying in a fearful position. You see moms grasping on to their children and other people in an embrace. They're in all different kinds of shapes. They've got their clothes still on, their sandals still on. One person we saw had the rags, or the parts of the pants, ripped, and sandals still on. It's an incredible experience. We're living in the shade of Pompeii, or living in the shade, I should say, of Vesuvius, like they are, or they did. You know, they woke up, and that day, everything violently came to a catastrophic end. Everyone, that whole city was wiped out, and it was buried under multiple feet of debris, and it took years to find it. And they had no idea. We are in America living in the shade of Vesuvius. You know, in the evening, they would enjoy the nice shade that Vesuvius would give over Pompeii as it's down at the foot of that volcano. And they had no idea that the lovely shade that they were basking in would someday be their death. We are in a point in American history, in our history here in America, at a critical, unique time that we've never lived in before. And we, as a nation, indeed as a world, but certainly as a nation, are living in the shade of Vesuvius. Most people in this country are unaware of the pressures that are building to destroy Western civilization. We're living at a moment in time where that Vesuvius could erupt and literally wipe out our system of life and our way of being. You know, all generations have said that their time is worse than before. But in our situation, I think we're living at critical times. Critical times that are different than anything before. Let me just give you a couple of things. In the area of the sanctity of human life, in the area of marriage as the union of a man and a woman, and in the area of religious freedom. Those are significantly different than any generation in American history. The sanctity of human life. In January 1973, 7 of the 9 justices said it's okay to kill your unborn child, completely changing world history. That it's all right, instead of being the safest place for your child in the womb, that is now the most dangerous place. 1 in 5 children, 1 in 5 people, if you look at any young person in here, line them up. 1 in 5 are not here because of abortion. 20% of the current population of all young people are gone because of abortion. And they're not just aborted in terms of some idea of that you can get them out of the way. They're brutally, barbarically ripped apart, tortured, brutalized in the worst possible way. But up until now, we have lived, coexisted. Shouldn't have, but we've coexisted with abortion. We've gone by the abortion clinics. We've coexisted with the idea that it's a woman's right to choose to kill an unborn child. But now, for the first time in world history, we've had a federal law, the Obamacare law, that says that you have to kill unborn children as a prerequisite to carrying out your mission. So, little sisters of the poor, I know you're called by God to ultimately minister to the people on the periphery, the downcast and the downtrodden, but if you want to do that, you've got to slaughter children. That's the criteria. It's a zero-sum game. Hobby Lobby, if you want to continue your business, you have to kill children. Now, it's nice that Hobby Lobby won a very razor-thin 5-4 decision, but that decision does not ultimately directly affect Little Sisters of the Poor or Liberty University that has a mission to train champions for Christ. That is a decision that's narrow on its face. And it was a razor-thin decision. Those decisions regarding the nonprofit organizations still have to be litigated. They're not done with Hobby Lobby. And even if they were, what's never been before the Supreme Court, what is in one of our cases, or has been in one of our cases, is the individual mandate that requires individuals for the first time in history to pay a separate fee in addition to your premium into a fund, the sole purpose of which is to fund abortion. So if you are in a private insurance or in an exchange, and anyone in that insurance has an abortion coverage, then everyone in that insurance, no matter your age, no matter your objection, in addition to your premium, have to pay an additional monthly premium so that that goes into a fund, and the sole purpose of that is abortion. And there was a secrecy clause that was put in there so that you and I wouldn't know which insurance plan has it. In every insurance plan, you go buy car insurance or any other insurance, you say, well, what does it cover? Well, I don't need that. I do need that. So you can pick and choose, and you can pick the kind of premium you want to pay for what you need. But under Obamacare, you can't find out which policy covers abortion until you pay your premium. Then they give you the benefits, but then you're locked in for a year. It was designed that way so you couldn't opt out or not choose a policy that covers abortion. We are individually, despite the Hobby Lobby decision, being forced as individuals, many of us, to fund abortion in a segregated fund. We've never had that before. This doesn't use money to have a knee surgery or some other kind of physical intervention. It is solely for the purpose of killing unborn children. We've never crossed that line before. If we do not ultimately turn this tide, how in the world can you and I, how can this country condemn Adolf Hitler? Because what we are doing and have done in this country is worse than the Holocaust, as bad as it is. And I have many friends who lost families in the Holocaust. But in terms of sheer numbers, in terms of the sheer numbers of the people who have died by abortion and now by the acceleration of abortion under this administration, we are far outnumbering all the men and women who've died in all of our wars combined. In fact, that's a small number when you look at it compared to those who have died by abortion. And we've clearly outnumbered the 6 or 12 million people that were killed in the Holocaust. As horrible as that was, we've got 55+ million. The numbers are staggering. If we don't change, God cannot and He will not continue to bless America. Pure and simple. It doesn't matter what kind of military strength we have, we simply cannot be blessed. Deuteronomy 28 says that if you follow God, then when the enemy comes after you, you'll put him to flight 7 times, 7 different directions. But on the other hand, if you don't follow God in Deuteronomy 28 and 15 and forward, then you'll flee in 7 directions. It doesn't matter how inherently strong you are. What really matters is whether God is on your side. Now, in the area of marriage, yesterday, a state judge in Florida, in the Keys, who I was before just about 10 days ago, who was clueless about procedural law, let alone the substantive law, issued a ruling that said marriage in Florida as the union of a man and a woman is unconstitutional. My wife and I drafted the Florida Marriage Protection Amendment. We worked on that for multiple years. I argued it before the Florida Supreme Court, and we got a 7-0 decision on it to get it on the ballot. It was the first time in the history of Florida where a constitutional ballot, and it's the only state that requires 60% for passage, passed in the state of Florida. And it was purely a grassroots movement. It was the largest, and still is the largest, grassroots movement to pass anything, to get signatures on anything in the history of the state of Florida. And yet this singular judge down in the Keys said that God's created natural order as the union of a man and woman is unconstitutional. Well, the Florida Marriage Protection Amendment did not create marriage. It did not define marriage. We didn't invent marriage when Anita and I drafted the language of it. We simply reaffirmed God's natural created order. You can't create gravity, you discover it and you put a name to it. But it is there, it is part of God's natural created order. We're not defining marriage. We don't create marriage. Marriage predates every religion. It wasn't created by religions. Religions supported, but it wasn't created by religions. It was before any religion, before any denomination. It's not something that is parochial to a nation. It predates all government. It is part of God's natural created order. It has, as Genesis shows, when God created you and I, He created us in His image as the crowning act of creation, the highest created order. And it has a unitive component where the two become one, where man and woman join together, where God created them male and female, it says. Husband and wife, they join together. It has a unitive component to marriage. It also has a procreative component to marriage, where that unit of man and woman, male and female, come together, and out of that relationship, procreation of another human being, the highest created order of God's creation, of all the magnificent things He's created, the highest created being, the highest created order is you and I. And you and I are able to participate in God's creation to create another individual in the image of God. It has a unitive, it has a procreative, and it has a spiritual component. When you go to Ephesians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul, speaking about husbands and wives and their relationship, goes back and forth between what husbands and wives ought to do and the respect and working together and the unity among them. But then it says, but I'm speaking of a profound mystery, because what I'm really speaking about is Christ and His relationship to the church. Somehow marriage is a sandbox illustration of God's love for us. It is Jesus uniting Himself to His body. Like in 1 Corinthians 6, the one sin that is different than all other sins, and don't let people say that all sins are created equal, because they're not. The scriptures do not support that idea. 1 Corinthians 6 says all other sins are outside of your body. But the sin of porneia, or pornography, sexual immorality, from where we get the word pornography in the Greek, the sin of sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. All other sins are outside the body. Sexual immorality is a sin against your body. So it says, do not join yourself to a prostitute, because you know, going back to the unitive, you become one with that prostitute. And your bodies are not yours. Why? Because they belong, they're united to Christ. Going back to the spiritual component that Paul is talking about. Marriage has a unitive, a procreative, and a spiritual component. We cannot redefine or have the hubris to think we can redefine marriage without consequences. Now, we could have judges, I don't care how many, or legislators, I don't care how numerous, want to pass a law or write an opinion that says marriage was good for the people back then, but it's now two people of the same sex, and you can't affirm God's natural created order as marriage. But that would be as silly and as ridiculous as a judge or a legislative body or even the people by popular vote saying, you know, the idea of gravity was good for the founders and, you know, they worked with that okay, but we really like the idea of being able to fly. We don't want to get into airplanes. We'd like to be able to jump and fly and have freedom. And it doesn't matter how many opinions or how many votes you have for that. You can't change God's natural created order. Marriage, the abolition of marriage is what we're facing right now, is literally an abolishing of gender. And it goes all the way back to Alfred Kinsey in 1948 with his book, Sexuality in the Human Male. And then in 53, Sexuality in the Human Female. It was the K-bomb that was dropped on the greatest generation coming back from World War II. And in his research, he did fraudulent research. We actually have individuals who now, one lives in California, one lives in Boston, who were the little kids whose father or grandfather, in one case, were being paid by Alfred Kinsey for the father to do sexual acts against his daughter, and in the other case, for the one to bring the boy to do sexual acts on Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey paid individuals and pimps to be able to get some of the so-called data he did. If you ever want to see how debased Kinsey is, go to Google or some kind of internet search engine and look for Kinsey Table 34. It comes from his book, 1948. What was his ultimate goal in presenting all of this fraudulent evidence? What was his ultimate goal in saying that human beings were sexual beings from birth, and even tried to do experiments on 2-month-old kids? And it's in Table 34, where he actually has a 2-year-old in that particular chart. He puts it right out there in front of you. Why did he want to liberate and remove all kinds of sexual mores on society? Why did he actually have the people that were in his organization engage in all kinds of sexual acts within each other, within the employment environment? Why? Because he would say, if you were afraid to do that, then you couldn't be scientific and objective, because you'd have some kind of moral objection to doing something sexual. He was an absolute perverted individual, but his goal was ultimately the abolition of the concept of God. He knew what his ultimate end goal was, is to destroy the image of understanding of God. And he did that by releasing all boundaries, all mores on human sexuality. So what we're dealing with today with regards to abortion and same-sex marriage, it all goes back to Alfred Kinsey in 48 and 53. And then who became his pamphleteer, his popular pamphleteer? It was Hugh Hefner in 1954. Hugh Hefner was a virgin when he was in college. He read Kinsey's books. He became liberated by Kinsey, and now even to this day he calls himself the pamphleteer of Kinsey. He popularized what Kinsey was doing in the academic world. Age of consents began to fall. The American the ALI, which does the model codes for criminal law, in 1954 began to lower the age of consent. Rape laws in terms of the punishment for rape began to fall. Law journals began to say there is really no victim in rape. Why? Because Kinsey said there is no harm in rape. Because he didn't interview the people who were raped, he interviewed the people who were the pimps, who found no harm in it. All of this is an abolition of gender, and when you abolish gender, you abolish God's natural created order. When you abolish the concept of male and female, the binary sex that God created in our existence, you're ultimately abolishing anything and the most obvious objective thing that we can have. And when you abolish that, you abolish everything that you can think about. It is a direct attack on God himself. That's why abortion and all of the same-sex that all has the same thing in common. Abortion is human sexuality outside the relationship of marriage without the consequence of procreation. Same-sex activity is human sexuality without the possibility of procreation. You can't simply substitute 2 men and 2 women and think that that's going to result in the same. Not only have studies, most recently in 2012, peer-reviewed studies out of the University of Texas shown that, not only studies here, but also in other parts of the world. But if you don't want to read the studies, just go with me to a jail, to a violent offender section where there's young men incarcerated, and ask these young men one question. Son, where was your father when you were growing up? and they will universally say, I had no father. Now, not everyone who grows up fatherless ends up there, but everyone who ends up there has one thing in common, and that is they were fatherless. When you ultimately say that 2 men and 2 women are just as good as a man and a woman, you have tampered with God's natural created order. You are damaging children. And the studies show that point after point in every scalable area of review, that the children are worse in every way than when they're raised with a home in a mom and a dad, male and female. You're damaging children. But not only do you damage children, and it's an assault on God himself, but now, and this is what's different about our society. Societies have had homosexuality and all kinds of sexual deviancy throughout the very beginning. It's nothing new. What is different for us is being forced to participate and affirm it. That's different. In Massachusetts, when same-sex marriage came there in 2004, Catholic Charities was forced to stop doing adoptions because they were forced to put children, the orphans that they were trying to find homes with moms and dads, into homes with 2 moms and 2 dads. And they said, we can't do that. It would violate our conscience. And Massachusetts said, you got to do it. If you don't do it, then you can't do adoptions. So they shut down in Massachusetts. I submit, and I appreciate what the Catholic Charities did in terms of the principle. But I submit if that ever happens again, and it will happen again, and it's happened in every other place that has adopted same-sex marriage, I submit that instead of Catholic Charities or any other adoption facility shutting down, that they say that that may be your opinion, but we are called to place orphans in homes with moms and dads. And if you want to force us to place them in a place that violates our religious conviction, then you bring out your National Guard and you shut us down, but we will not voluntarily comply. And for Little Sisters of the Poor, imagine if they ultimately said, we will not fund abortion. And they will not fund abortion. And imagine if the government then comes against them and says, you must fund abortion, otherwise you have to shut down. Can you imagine what America would do if we saw sisters, little nuns, being handcuffed and put in the back of police cars and taken down to the jail? Would America stand for that? I pray that we wouldn't stand for that. But I think we're coming into a unique time in which that may ultimately happen. I have no question about it. We are living in a different time. If you're a photographer in New Mexico and you want to be a photographer and you want to photograph weddings, now you have to photograph same-sex weddings, and if you refuse to do it, you can't be a photographer. Or if you're a baker and you want to bake cakes for weddings, you can't do it unless you bake cakes for same-sex weddings. Or if you're a bed and breakfast in Vermont, you can't have a facility that ultimately has receptions for weddings unless you also open it up for same-sex weddings, despite the fact that this one particular family is a Christian family and their sons and daughters are living in the same house. They now have to either choose to get out of the market or fund abortion. Or if you're a counselor in California or New Jersey, 2 cases that Liberty Counsel have, one that I just argued at the Federal Court of Appeals, one signed by a Democratic governor in California and Chris Christie, a Republican governor in New Jersey. And that is this: if you're a counselor or you're a minor and you're seeking counsel, you can't get any counsel to reduce or eliminate same-sex sexual attractions, behavior, or identity. So you could be molested by the likes of a Jerry Sandusky, develop these unwanted feelings and not want to act on them, do not consider yourself gay, and you want to go to a counselor, you talk to your mom and dad, you go to a counselor, that counselor now in California and in New Jersey cannot encourage you, help you reach your ultimate objective to not act on or to reduce or eliminate those same-sex attractions. Instead, they must say, I understand you've got these religious objections. I understand you've got some guilt. The problem is not with the feelings or the behavior that you're engaging in, if they're engaging in behavior. The problem is with the religious values. We need to change that. You just need to be comfortable with these feelings or the behavior. That's fine. It's just as natural and normal as left-handed. That's in California. That's in New Jersey. We've defeated it in 11 other states, but now it's also being debated in Washington, D.C. And we represent in both of those states, we represent David Pickup in California, who was sexually molested as a young boy, developed same-sex attractions, engaged in that behavior, ultimately gave his life to Jesus Christ and sought counseling and has left the homosexual lifestyle. Now he's a professional counselor seeking to help other people who have gone through some similar struggles that he experienced. In New Jersey, Dr. Tara King, sexually molested as a young girl, developed same-sex attractions, and she went to a counselor, and the counselor said, you just have to accept you're gay. She didn't want to accept that. She ultimately went to a Christian event, gave her life to Christ, sought counseling, and for 24 years now she hasn't had any same-sex attractions or feelings. She wants to be able to share her story with a young boy or a girl that comes in with mom and dad. They're struggling because in this case, both cases, we have clients who began to cut themselves when they began to feel this before they confided in their mom and dad. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't like it. It conflicted with their value system. They ultimately lost the relationships with their peers at school. Relationship with mom and dad went down. One of them was on the edge of a balcony thinking that he's going to just end it all. He doesn't want to be like this. He doesn't want to identify this way. He wants to jump off the balcony. In both cases, they came to their parents and confided in them what was happening. They ultimately sought out professional Christian counselors who were experienced in this area. In both cases, they've been able to eliminate, they've been able to have their self-esteem come back. They no longer think about ending their life. They see hope. And in fact, we just got an email from the family of one of the boys, 15-year-old boy in California. He no longer has these feelings anymore. And he is concerned that he will be able not to get any more counseling there. These are families that are struggling. In every area of counseling, you're able to help that young boy or girl to be able to reach their ultimate objective and to help them on that way. Except in this area, they're being forced to affirm something that is evil. We've never been in this situation before. We will not be able to escape the coercive nature of this issue. It is cataclysmic in its change effect. It is, I believe, ultimately the beginning of the end of Western civilization if we adopt this as a country. Now the question is, what will God's people do? What will the church do? You know, obviously we need to register and we need to vote. Voting is not a political act. It's a prophetic witness to the community. As we act and believe on Sunday, we must do and act on Monday and Tuesday and all the way through Saturday and the rest of the week. If we believe that God is the Creator and that to take an innocent human life and to slaughter that young, innocent, helpless child is murder and a sin, then how can we either appoint an agent through our vote to act on our behalf that does exactly the opposite, or how can we alternatively not do anything and let our neighbor appoint an agent for both of us to do something contrary to God's will? It is not a political act, it is a prophetic witness to the community. We will be held accountable for either our vote or lack thereof. But you know, with all the things that we're facing, and we're facing a time in American history, and I emphasize American history, that is different than anything we've ever faced before. We've never crossed the line to be forced to kill people. We've never been forced to ultimately affirm something that's absolutely evil, and if we don't affirm it, we're punished or we're going to have our license revoked. Or if you're Chick-fil-A and you say, I believe in marriage as one man and one woman, then a mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, and others, they say, well, if that's what you believe, you can't have a license to operate a Chick-fil-A in my community. We've never had that before. We're in a cataclysmic catastrophe. We cannot escape this anymore. We cannot just simply go blindly and living in the shade of Vesuvius. It is starting to erupt, and the question is, what are we going to do? Well, in American history, you have 200 plus years of history, and that's a great history. But I have a friend who always reminds me that as Christians, we have 2,000 years of history. And as believers in the book, we've got more thousands of years history before that, with the people of God and the call of Abraham and the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. And when Egypt rose up and Pharaoh wanted to ultimately brutalize God's people, instead of annihilating them, God rose up Moses, who said, let my people go, in the face of a Pharaoh who was a tyrant. And we have the Exodus. And today we celebrate Passover rather than tragedy. And when the king of Persia decided to ultimately set a day, and actually had a day, which is worse than anything we could imagine, where the entire population of Jews were going to be killed on that day. God raised up Esther, and today we don't celebrate the doom of the Israelite nation under the king of Persia. We celebrate the Feast of Purim. And in fact, during the Feast of Purim, Jews come together and they bake cookies. They're called Haman's ears, and they eat them with joy. And they read from the book of Esther, and every time Haman's name is said, they have things like little noisemakers to deride Haman. God turned the gallows that Haman wanted to use against Haman himself. God is a God of irony. When the king says, what shall I do for a man who is worthy of honor? And Haman's thinking, oh, it's me. This is what you should do. And he said, great. I agree that this is what we should do. Put Mordecai in there and lead him through the city and shout how great of a man this is. God is a God of irony. He will not be mocked. There were worse times in history during the incarceration of God's people in Egypt, during the set annihilation by the king of Persia. And when Jesus was born, the maniacal King Herod ultimately set out to destroy that young Messiah and to kill all the baby boys 2 years old and under. But instead of the end, today we celebrate Christmas. And when Satan was dancing on the tomb of Christ, when that stone was put in front of him and he's gone and he's dead, we don't celebrate or mourn the end of a life. We celebrate the resurrection of the living Lord, and today we celebrate Easter. Amen. I've been to Israel multiple times, and I've stood in Caesarea Philippi. And that's where Jesus is asking the disciples a question. And Caesarea Philippi is the heart of paganism. It was the gate of hell, or the gates of Hades. It's right there. And in the side of the mountain are still the altars carved into the mountainside, different ones for Pan and other gods. It's where we get our word panic, the god Pan. They would sacrifice goats or sheep to Pan. They would throw them into the water that comes down from Mount Hermon. That ultimately is one of the tributaries that feeds the sea, the river, the Jordan River. And the panic would be how long it would take. Would that sacrifice either float or would it sink? And during that short time when they threw it into the water, they were panicking, wondering whether their sacrifice would ultimately be accepted by the god Pan. This was the epicenter of paganism. And Jesus takes his disciples right there, not someplace else, right in the heart of paganism. And he asked his disciples, who do men say that I am? And they said, well, some say you're Elijah, John the Baptist, or maybe one of the other prophets. And he said, but who do you say that I am? You are Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. And Jesus says, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. When are we as Christians going to live like that is reality? When are we as Christians going to live that despite a Pharaoh, God will raise up a Moses, that despite a king of Persia, God will raise up an Esther, that despite a Herod, God will ultimately protect his own people, that despite all those adversaries, God will ultimately turn what is adversity into an opportunity? Let me share with you a story. It's about Harry Mahet, who's one of our senior litigation counsel for Liberty Counsel. Harry is a great attorney. He's seen what it's like on the other side, looking out from America inside, this great city on a hill. And he sees now where we ultimately are going, because he was raised in communist Romania. Communist Romania, his dad was a pastor, and there was a number of pastors there. Many of them are here in the United States. They still have the scars on their back from the brutal beatings of the communists. Well, one day, Harry's dad was there in the home with him and his mom. They're sleeping. The Secret Service knocks on the door. The dogs come in. They've got their German shepherds. They're there to sniff out the contraband, which are the suspected Bibles that the missionaries had smuggled in. So the dad goes and meets these Secret Service people at the door, Harry's a young boy. The mom goes into the kitchen, and there the Bibles are that they're looking for. So she takes a piece of plywood, throws it on top of them. It's kind of cockeyed, but, you know, for communist work, it's okay. And she takes a sheet, throws over the top of it, so it's like a cockeyed table. And then she takes some of the coffee that the missionaries had smuggled in. And, you know, in communism, they don't have much of a choice. So they have one brand of coffee, and everyone knows it, smells the same, and so forth. So she's now having this nice new aroma of coffee, and they love it. So she invites them into the kitchen, and guess where she serves them? She serves them the coffee right on the table with the German Shepherd dogs all around the table. And they're just loving the smell of the aroma of the coffee. They had a good time laughing and having fun drinking the coffee. They left, they never saw the Bibles. Harry went to school, to church on Sunday, not school, because their school began on Sunday, not Monday, as it does here. And so all the Christians would skip school one day a week, and they would go on Sunday to church. So when they came on Monday, all the Christian kids, Harry included, they would be put in the middle. All the kids would circle them, and the teachers would taunt these little Christian kids for not being there the day before. He grew up with toilet paper that was shredded out of Bibles. But the communists never did anything very well. So when you shred things, you know, sometimes it doesn't always get shredded. So people would use the outhouses or whatever facility they had with their paper that was shredded, made out of Bibles that they would find, smuggled in from the missionaries, and they would sit in there and there would be a Bible verse. The communists never did anything well. But one day they arrested a pastor in Harry's city. This pastor had preached off script. That had happened many times before. People just continued to go on. But this day was different. The church at this pastor's church decided to go outside of his house and pray. And they began to pray. And they began to shout, "Libertate, libertate," because the human spirit longs for freedom and liberty. God created us that way. "For freedom I have come to set you free," Jesus says. They were praying. They were calling for God to intervene in their life, in their miserable lives in communist Romania. They were shouting for liberty. More people came as the nightfall came. The city of about 400,000, which was a pretty large city, began to show up. As nightfall came, they saw more people praying. And the entire city was out there. The town square was full. So Ceausescu, the dictator, he didn't like it. He sent in his military people to shoot at his own people to quell that uprising. But it didn't stop it there, because in another place in communist Romania, the church began to pray as well. And they began to shout, "We need God. We need God," they would say. And "Libertate, libertate, liberty, liberty." Ceausescu had had enough. So he ultimately called a meeting in Bucharest, the capital of Romania. But while he was there, people began to shout, "Libertate, libertate, liberty, 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 liberty. We need God, we need God." And they ultimately captured Ceausescu. They tried and convicted him, and they hung him in a period of 24 hours on Christmas Day, December 25, 1989. Harry Mahet and his family and all the Romanians under the repressive communist regime experienced liberty on Christmas Day for the very first time in their lives. And all of that began 2 weeks before, when the church got together and they said, "Enough is enough. We will pray and seek God's face." They ultimately believed in the scriptures that if you seek God's face, turn from your wicked ways, ask Him to intervene in your life, forgive our sins, God will listen, He'll hear, He'll forgive our sins, and He will heal our land. God birthed you and I for such a time as this. He is the God of impossibilities. Don't think impossible realms, because that's a human invention. God is in the impossible realm. We always limit God by thinking of what's possible, and so we set our goals as to what's possible, and when we achieve it, we think, "Oh, great, that was our ingenuity, that was our hard work." We pat ourselves on the back, but God works in the impossible realm. Nothing is impossible for God. Pharaoh was not an impossibility to God. The king of Persia was not an impossibility. The maniacal king Herod, the maniacal builder, the maniac, he was not a match for God Almighty. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He has birthed us for this moment in history. This is a different time. The question is not whether God can ultimately change this country. The question is whether or not his people will stand up. And we have a clear example of that kind of decision when God led his people out of Egypt. When they got to the edge of the promised land, God didn't want to have them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. He brought them to the edge of the promised land so they could go into the promised land. And so they sent the 12 spies for a reconnaissance mission. 10 of those saw the same news, read the same papers, saw the same experiences, experienced the same everything as the other 2. But when they came back, they did not know the God of impossibilities. They saw the giants, they couldn't see God. But the other 2, Joshua and Caleb, saw God, and the giants were minimal. They were nothing to them. They said, let's go in, we can do it, God's on our side. But unfortunately, the people listened to the 10 naysayers, the doubters, those who didn't have any faith, and they wandered and squandered their miserable lives in a desert for 40 years. Their bones are there. We have no idea what their names are. There's only 2 that we know, the 2 that had faith. This is a time that God has ordained. This is our generation. This is our America. This is not just America, but this affects the world. God birthed you and I for this moment in history. Let's stand up and be the church. Let the church be the church, and let the church arise. Let us ultimately call on the name of Jesus Christ, and he will heal, and he will forgive, and he will ultimately restore our land. May God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America.